Standing in the heart of Jackson Ward at 00 Clay Street here in Richmond is the current building, which houses the Black History Museum and Cultural Arts Center of Virginia. It was founded by Carol Anderson Sr. and opened its doors to the public in 1991. This current building was purchased back in 1922 by the Council of Colored Women under the leadership of Mrs. Maggie L. Walker. Jackson Ward was revered in its heyday as the cultural mecca of Black society in the South. It was also nicknamed the Little Harlem of the South and the Black Capitalism Hub. There is so much rich heritage to absorb on a short walk through Jackson Ward.
Once again, welcome to What Works RVA, where we highlight people, places, things, and of course today we're standing in front of the Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site. We're here with Ranger George Peterson.
Good morning, sir.
And there's a lot of history here.
There certainly is, sir. Mrs. Walker's house was built in 1883. She'd be the third person to own that house. And it was on what was called Quality Row. Well, the reason it got called that name was because when Mrs. Walker lived here, in addition to her neighbors were prominent African-American business owners, doctors, and insurance executives. So this was kind of the creme de la creme of the African-American community that Mrs. Walker lived in.
Right.
Her house, the architectural style, is called Gothic Revival in the Italianate style. And Italianate refers to those carved lintels you see over the windows,
sure, and
that intricate cornice work you see below the eave of the house. She's going to buy the house herself in 1904 for the princely sum of $4,800.
Wow.
It's going to take her about a year to move in because she'll make some changes to the house.
Sure.
She'll buy it from a doctor by the name of Robert Jones.
Sure.
So she believed in promoting advancement of the race and African Americans buying from other African Americans. So she was trying to concentrate African American buying power and purchasing power here in Jackson Ward. And that's one of the reasons that Mrs. Walker is so well known is because of her business ability and as leader of the Independent Order of St. Luke, as well as the president of the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank.
That's right. Very influential lady.
She was. She was nationally known. Mrs. Walker was one of the founding members of the NAACP here in Richmond. Mrs. Walker also was quite influential in trying to bring about women's rights. She was very supportive of women's rights to vote. She went out and tried to get women out to vote when the vote came around in the early 20s. And Mrs. Walker was also one who was a proponent of African American rights, and she was a strong supporter of the streetcar boycott in the early part of the 19th century here.
She impacted the city of Richmond greatly, and I'm sure that has a lot to do with a school just a few blocks west of here being named after her.
Yes, sir. One of Mrs. Walker's legacies is that in 1938, a school was named for here in Richmond. It was the Maggie L. Walker High School. In those days, a segregated school.
Sure.
Today, it's the Maggie L. Walker Governor's School, an excellent school, worthy of Mrs. Walker's name, I believe.
The building you're going to see in front of you when we go out the back door is the Carriage House Garage. We still use it. There's a Park Service vehicle in there. In 1904, the Independent Order of St. Luke bought Mrs. Walker a Christmas present. It was a carriage, 2 horses, and a coachman's uniform. Mrs. Walker will keep that carriage until around 1911 when she buys an electric car. Then she's going to have a series of luxury cars until 1928 when she has a Packard limousine. But you can imagine Mrs. Walker will come out of her bedroom, come down the hallway above us here, into the girls' room, down the elevator, into the playroom. Alfonso, the chauffeur, would push her down the hallway. There was a ramp that connected the back of the house with the carriage house. She'd push him down the ramp, onto a platform, into the back seat of the Packard, and away Mrs. Walker would go. Now, we only recently verified that in 1932, Mrs. Walker owned a Pierce Arrow. If you're unacquainted with that car, it is a step up from a Packard, roughly equivalent to a Rolls Royce. Now, sometimes we do have visitors that really get caught up in Mrs. Walker's material possessions. How big this house is, her cars, that sort of thing. And that's not what I'd like you to remember about Mrs. Walker. So to illustrate what I would like you to remember, can we agree she was very successful professionally? But to really appreciate Mrs. Walker's professional success, you have to view it from the lens of her personal life, which was very tragic. Even though Mrs. Walker's biological father lives here in Richmond, she never really gets to know him. Her stepfather, William Mitchell, is going to disappear in 1876. Her middle son is going to die at 7 months old in 1894. Her brother, Johnny, is going to die in that same year. 1908, she falls in the house and breaks her kneecap and walks with a limp until she's confined to the wheelchair. But she gets a cool nickname from the Richmond Planet. They call her the Lame Lioness after that. Then in 1915, her husband is accidentally killed by her oldest son. 1922, her mother dies. 1923, her oldest son dies. And in 1928, Mrs. Walker is confined to the wheelchair. But through all that sadness and adversity, Mrs. Walker continues to help people. She tries to bring about social change and is a role model to all women, but particularly African American women. So that's what I'd like you to remember about Mrs. Walker. The way the neighborhood is going, you have the neighborhood on one hand being fixed up, people coming in, buying places, fixing them up, and it's a process called gentrification. So the houses look better, the prices go up, tax base goes up. The downside is that some of the original people who lived here can't live here.